The relentless autumn wind swept across the plains of Wyoming Territory as Grace Richardson clutched her threadbare coat tighter around her shoulders, staring at the impossible sight before her. There, just as promised in his last letter, stood a man tall, weathered and patient at the junction where the stagecoach road met the trail to what would be her new home. He'd been waiting for 3 days straight, and despite her delayed arrival, Daniel Whitaker hadn't moved from his post. The year was 1876, and Grace was exactly 48 hours late for her own wedding. "Miss Richardson?" His voice carried across the distance between them, deep and uncertain. Grace stepped down from the stagecoach with trembling legs, her small carpet bag containing every possession she owned clutched in white-knuckled fingers. "Mr. Whitaker," she confirmed, finding her voice despite the dust and exhaustion of her journey. "I feared you would have given up on me." Daniel Whitaker stood perfectly still, hat in hand, his sun-bronzed face impossible to read in the fading light. He was taller than she had imagined from his letters, broader through the shoulders, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners as he studied her. "I made a promise, madam," he said simply. "I told you I'd be waiting at this junction until you arrived. Didn't matter how many days it took." Grace swallowed hard, suddenly aware of her wrinkled dress and disheveled appearance after the grueling journey from Boston. She was 22 years old and had traveled nearly 2,000 miles to marry a man she knew only through 6 months of correspondence. "The stagecoach broke an axle outside of Cheyenne," she explained, feeling the need to account for her tardiness. "Then there was a washout on the road. I sent word with a passing rider, but I suppose no word reached me," Daniel confirmed, finally taking a step toward her. "But it doesn't matter now. You're here." The stagecoach driver tossed down her second bag, tipped his hat, and with a crack of his whip continued on his route, leaving them alone on the windswept plain. Daniel cleared his throat. "My ranch is about 4 miles west. I've got a wagon just beyond those trees." He gestured vaguely, then seemed to remember himself. "Unless you'd prefer we go straight to town, to the preacher's, or perhaps you'd like to rest at the boarding house before making any decisions." The consideration in his voice nearly undid her. After the callousness of the other passengers, the hard wooden bench of the stagecoach, and the fear that had dogged her every mile that this might all be some elaborate hoax, Daniel Whitaker's simple kindness was almost too much to bear. "I think," Grace said carefully, "that I would like to see this ranch you've written so much about." A genuine smile broke across his face, transforming his solemn features. "I hoped you'd say that." He reached for her bags. "The place isn't much yet, but I've been working on it these past months. Built a proper bedroom for you, with a window facing east like you mentioned liking in your letters." Grace felt a warmth spread through her chest. He'd remembered such a small detail. "I'm sorry I kept you waiting," she said, falling into step beside him as they walked toward a small grove of cottonwoods. Daniel glanced down at her. "I would have waited another week if needed." "You can't mean that," Grace replied, studying his profile. "Standing out in all weather sleeping where, under your wagon," a hint of color appeared on his tanned cheeks, "had a bedroll, and Samson kept me company." At her questioning look, he added, "My horse, you'll meet him soon enough." As they reached the wagon, Grace noticed a small bundle of wildflowers tied with twine resting on the seat. Daniel saw her looking and quickly tucked them behind his back. "They're a bit wilted now," he said, embarrassment clear in his voice. "Been 3 days. I picked fresh ones each morning, but—" Grace reached for them. "May I?" Wordlessly, he handed her the small bouquet prairie flowers in yellows and purples, dried by the wind but carefully gathered. "No one has ever given me flowers before," she admitted, bringing them to her nose despite their faded condition. Daniel helped her onto the wagon seat. "I aim to remedy that, Miss Richardson." "Grace," she corrected gently. "If we're to be married, you should call me Grace." He nodded, settling beside her and taking up the reins. "And I'm Daniel, though most folks call me Dan." The wagon lurched forward, and Grace found herself studying the man who would be her husband. His hands were strong and capable on the reins, his profile handsome in a rugged way, with a straight nose and firm jaw covered in stubble that suggested he hadn't taken time to shave during his vigil. "Tell me truthfully," she ventured after they had traveled in comfortable silence for a while. "What would you have done if I hadn't come at all?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. The wagon wheels creaked as they crossed a small stream. "I reckon I would have eventually understood," he said finally. "A woman traveling alone across the country to marry a stranger, it takes remarkable courage. I wouldn't have blamed you for changing your mind, but I promised," Grace said. His eyes met hers briefly. "Yes, you did, and now I know your promises mean something." They rounded a bend, and suddenly the land opened up before them. A modest cabin stood nestled against a backdrop of rolling hills, a barn and corral to one side, a garden plot to the other. Smoke rose from the chimney. "You left a fire going while you waited for me?" Grace asked, surprised. Daniel shook his head. "That would be Mrs. Holloway. Neighbor from the next property. She's been looking after things while I was waiting, probably left a meal for us too." The thought of someone preparing for her arrival made Grace's throat tighten. "You have kind neighbors." "Folk look out for each other out here," Daniel explained as he guided the wagon toward the cabin. "Have to. Winter's coming and it gets harsh in these parts." Grace took in the scene, comparing it to the careful descriptions from his letters. The cabin was smaller than she had imagined but sturdily built. The barn was new, the wood still raw and unweathered. A small fenced garden showed signs of recent harvest. "It's not much," Daniel said, echoing his earlier words, a note of uncertainty in his voice. Grace turned to look at him, really look at him. A man who had stood at a crossroads for 3 days on the strength of a promise, who had built a room with an east-facing window because of a casual comment in a letter, who had picked fresh flowers each morning in hope of her arrival. "It's more than I dared hope for," she said truthfully. The relief on his face was palpable. He jumped down from the wagon and came around to help her descend. His hands were strong at her waist, and for a brief moment, as her feet touched the ground, they stood close enough that she could smell leather and wood smoke on his clothes. "Welcome home, Grace," he said softly. The word home struck her like a physical force. She hadn't had a real home since her parents died 4 years ago, leaving her to depend on the reluctant charity of distant relatives who made it clear she was a burden. The advertisement for a wife to share a ranch in Wyoming Territory had been her desperate gamble for something of her own. Before she could respond, the cabin door swung open and a stout woman with iron-gray hair emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. "Well, she's here at last," the woman declared, bustling toward them. "And pretty as a picture, just as you insisted she'd be, Daniel Whitaker." Daniel's ears reddened. "Mrs. Holloway, this is Miss Grace Richardson. Grace, this is Margaret Holloway, who's been keeping me fed these past 3 years. Mrs. Holloway enveloped Grace in a surprisingly strong hug. "Heavens, child, you're thin as a rail. Come inside before you blow away in this wind. I've got stew simmering and fresh bread cooling." Grace found herself ushered into the cabin, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the dimmer light inside. The main room was simply furnished but clean, with a table and chairs, a small sofa before the fireplace, and shelves holding books more than she would have expected on a frontier ranch. A curtained doorway presumably led to the bedroom Daniel had mentioned. The whole space smelled of pine and savory stew, and something indefinable that she supposed was simply the scent of Daniel himself. "Now then," Mrs. Holloway said, releasing Grace and turning to Daniel. "The preacher's expecting you both tomorrow at 11. I've spread the word, so folks will gather after for a proper celebration. The Millers are bringing their fiddle and everyone's contributing food." Daniel looked startled. "You arranged all that?" The older woman gave him a stern look. "Did you expect to bring this lovely young woman all the way from Boston and not have a proper wedding? What would people think?" "I hadn't thought," Daniel began. "That's clear enough," Mrs. Holloway interrupted, but her tone was affectionate. She turned back to Grace. Unless you'd prefer something private, dear? Don't let me steamroll you on your first day here. Grace felt a flutter of nervousness at the mention of tomorrow's wedding, but found herself smiling. A celebration sounds wonderful, Mrs. Holloway. I've come all this way to begin a new life. I'd be honored to meet my new neighbors. The older woman patted her hand approvingly. Good girl, now I'll serve you both supper and then make myself scarce. You two have matters to discuss, I'm sure. Daniel cleared his throat. I can sleep in the barn tonight, he offered. So you can have your privacy. Mrs. Holloway rolled her eyes as she ladled stew into bowls. Nonsense. It's nearly freezing out there after dark. The sofa is perfectly adequate for one night. After they'd eaten the best meal Grace had enjoyed since leaving Boston, Mrs. Holloway gathered her things to leave. My Tom will wonder where I've got to, she said, pulling on her coat. I've left plenty of food for breakfast. Daniel knows where everything is kept. She paused at the door, giving them both a warm smile. I'm glad you made it safely, dear. This man has been writing your name in the dirt with his boot toe for 3 days straight while he waited. Never seen him so anxious about anything. After she left, a silence fell between them. Grace became acutely aware that they were alone in the small cabin, the only sounds the crackling fire and the wind rattling the shutters. Daniel stood awkwardly by the table. Would you like to see the rest of the house? It's not much to show, just the one bedroom, but I want you to feel at home. Grace nodded, grateful for the distraction. Please. He led her to the curtained doorway and drew back the fabric. The bedroom was small but thoughtfully arranged, with a sturdy bed covered in a colorful quilt, a chest of drawers, and a small table beside the window which, as promised, faced east. Mrs. Holloway made the quilt as a wedding present, Daniel explained. Said every bride needs something pretty to start with. Grace ran her fingers over the intricate stitching. It's beautiful. I built the furniture myself, Daniel added, a note of pride creeping into his voice. The chest of drawers is empty, waiting for your things. She noticed a small bookshelf on the wall. You have quite a collection of books. I read a lot during winter evenings, he said. Not much else to do when the snow's piled high. I remember you wrote that you enjoyed Dickens. Grace smiled. You remembered correctly. I remembered everything you wrote, Daniel said quietly. The simple honesty in his voice made her turn to look at him. He stood in the doorway, hat in his hands, uncertainty and hope warring in his expression. I should let you rest, he said. Tomorrow will be a busy day, if the whole county's turning out like Mrs. Holloway says. Grace nodded, suddenly overcome with the enormity of her situation. Tomorrow she would marry this man, this kind, patient stranger who had waited 3 days at a crossroads because he'd given his word. Daniel, she said, stopping him as he turned to go, thank you for waiting for me. A smile touched his lips. I would have waited longer, Grace. The night passed restlessly for Grace. Despite her exhaustion from the journey, sleep came in fits and starts. She lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the prairie night, the howl of distant coyotes, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the occasional creak of Daniel turning on the sofa in the other room. Morning brought crisp air and brilliant sunshine streaming through her east-facing window, just as Daniel had promised. Grace rose early, washed in the basin of water he had thoughtfully left for her, and dressed in the best of her limited wardrobe, a blue calico dress she had carefully preserved for this day. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Daniel already up, stoking the fire and heating coffee. He had shaved, his jaw now smooth, and wore clean clothes that showed signs of careful pressing. Good morning, he said, straightening up quickly at the sight of her. Did you sleep well? Well enough, she replied, noticing how the morning light caught in his dark hair, revealing strands of auburn she hadn't noticed before. And you, the sofa couldn't have been comfortable, he smiled. I've slept in far worse places. They shared a simple breakfast, both too nervous to eat much. As they cleared the dishes, Daniel paused. Grace, before we head to town, I want to say something. He set down the plate he was holding and faced her. I know this isn't how most people begin a marriage. We're still strangers in many ways. If you have any doubts, any at all, we can delay today. Or I can arrange passage back to Boston if that's what you decide you want. Grace studied him, touched by his consideration. Do you have doubts, Daniel? He shook his head without hesitation. Not a single one. Your letters showed me the kind of person you are: thoughtful, brave, kind. Meeting you has only confirmed what I already believed. Then neither do I, she said firmly. I left nothing behind in Boston but unhappy memories. I came west looking for a new beginning, and I've found it, with you. The relief on his face was palpable. Then let's get married, Grace Richardson. The small church in town was filled to capacity when they arrived. Grace was overwhelmed by the turnout. Dozens of families from surrounding homesteads and ranches had come to welcome her, most bringing food or small gifts. Many had traveled hours to attend. The ceremony itself was simple and brief. The aging preacher had them repeat traditional vows, and Daniel slipped a slender gold band onto Grace's finger, another detail he had arranged in advance, another sign of his faith that she would come. I now pronounce you man and wife, the preacher declared, and the church erupted in cheers and applause. What followed was unlike any celebration Grace had ever experienced. Tables were quickly arranged in the town square, laden with food contributed by every family. A trio of musicians struck up lively tunes, and soon dancing began, with Daniel and Grace obliged to take the first turn. I should warn you, Daniel murmured as he took her in his arms, I'm not much of a dancer. Grace smiled up at him. Then we'll learn together. As they moved somewhat awkwardly to the music, Grace caught fragments of conversations around them. 3 days he stood at that junction. Never seen a man more determined. She's traveled all alone, brave as can be. The celebration continued well into the afternoon. Grace was introduced to so many neighbors she couldn't keep the names straight. Everyone had a kind word or a story about Daniel: how he'd helped raise a barn, delivered a calf in a blizzard, taught the schoolchildren about constellations. Your husband is well respected here, observed a woman who had introduced herself as Sarah Miller, wife of the fiddle player. The word husband gave Grace a momentary start. Yes, I'm beginning to see that. It's not an easy life out here, Sarah continued, watching the dancing with a practiced eye. But it's a good one if you've got the right partner. Dan Whitaker's one of the good ones. As the sun began to set, they made their farewells and started the journey back to the ranch. The wagon was now loaded with wedding gifts, practical items mostly: preserves, candles, hand-knitted blankets, a set of cooking pots. They rode in companionable silence for a while, both processing the events of the day. When the cabin came into view, Daniel stopped the wagon. What is it? Grace asked, confused. He set the brake and turned to her with a small smile. Tradition, he explained, climbing down and coming around to her side. Before she could question him further, he had lifted her easily into his arms. Daniel, she gasped, instinctively wrapping her arms around his neck. A husband is supposed to carry his bride over the threshold, he said, his voice warm and close to her ear. I intend to do this properly. He carried her to the cabin door, somehow managing to open it without setting her down, and stepped inside. The fire had died down to embers during their absence, casting the room in a warm, golden glow. Daniel gently set Grace on her feet but didn't immediately release her. For a long moment, they stood close together in the dimly lit cabin, his hands still at her waist, her arms still around his neck. I should build up the fire, he said finally, his voice low. Grace nodded, reluctantly stepping back. And I should put away these gifts. They moved around each other carefully as they settled into the evening routine, both acutely aware of the changed nature of their relationship. Daniel built up the fire while Grace arranged their gifts, finding places for each item in what was now their home. Later, as the fire crackled warmly and night settled fully over the prairie, they sat side by side on the sofa, a respectful distance between them. Was it very different from what you imagined? Daniel asked, his gaze on the flames. This place, I mean, the life here. Grace considered the question. It's harder in some ways. The journey was difficult, the land is wilder than I pictured, but the people are kinder than I dared hope. She turned to look at him. You're kinder than I dared hope. Daniel's expression softened. I want you to be happy here, Grace. I know it's asking a lot, bringing you to this remote place, asking you to share this life with a man you barely know. I know more than you might think, she said. Your letters told me much about your character, and today, hearing how your neighbors speak of you, I learned even more. All good things, I hope, he said with a small smile. Very good things, she assured him. Though no one warned me you'd stand for 3 days straight at a crossroads. Daniel laughed softly. I didn't tell anyone my plan, thought they might try to talk some sense into me. Why did you wait so long? She asked, genuinely curious. Most men would have assumed I wasn't coming after the first day. He was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. When I was 17, my father left to find work during a drought, promised he'd be back in 2 weeks with enough money to save our farm. Daniel's voice grew distant with memory. My mother and I waited. 2 weeks became 3, then a month. Neighbors told her to assume the worst, but she wouldn't. She stood at our farm gate every evening watching the road. Grace's heart ached at the story. Did he ever come back? Daniel nodded. 6 months later, he'd been injured, spent months recovering in a town 300 miles away. By then, we'd lost the farm, moved in with relatives, but she was right to wait. He turned to look at Grace, his eyes reflecting the firelight. Sometimes people are delayed for reasons beyond their control, doesn't mean they've broken their promise. Grace reached across the space between them and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. I'm glad you waited, she whispered. I'm glad you came, he replied. Later that night, as Grace prepared for bed in their bedroom, she heard a soft knock on the door frame. Grace, Daniel's voice was hesitant. I just wanted to say good night. She opened the door to find him standing there, still fully dressed. You're not coming to bed? She asked, then felt her cheeks flush at her own boldness. Daniel's expression was gentle. I thought. That is, I don't expect. We hardly know each other, and I want you to feel comfortable. I can sleep on the sofa until Grace took his hand, silencing him. Daniel, today I became your wife. This is our home, and this is our bed. I may not know everything about you yet, but I know enough to be certain of my choice. The look in his eyes made her heart beat faster. Slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind, he raised his free hand to her cheek, his touch feather light. I will spend every day trying to be worthy of your trust, he promised. Grace leaned into his touch. And I will spend every day grateful that you waited for me. When he finally kissed her, it felt like coming home after a very long journey. As winter settled over the Wyoming Territory, Grace discovered the rhythm of life on the frontier. Days were filled with work cooking, cleaning, helping Daniel with the livestock, learning to manage a household in a place where the nearest store was a half-day's ride away. Nights were spent by the fire, reading aloud from Daniel's books or writing letters to Mrs. Holloway, who had become a dear friend and frequent visitor. And through it all, Grace fell deeper in love with the patient, thoughtful man who had waited for her at a crossroads. One snowy evening in December, as they sat before the fire, Daniel placed something in her lap, a small wooden box beautifully carved with wildflowers. What's this? She asked, running her fingers over the intricate design. Open it, he encouraged. Inside, she found a delicate silver locket. When she pressed the tiny catch, it opened to reveal a miniature drawing of their cabin. I had it commissioned when I was in town last week, Daniel explained. So no matter where life takes you, you'll always have a picture of home. Grace closed her hand around the precious gift. I'm never going anywhere without you, she promised. Daniel smiled and pulled her close. Even if you did, I'd wait for you, as long as it took. As the winter winds howled outside their snug cabin, Grace rested her head against her husband's shoulder, marveling at how a delayed stagecoach and a man's stubborn promise had led her exactly where she belonged. 5 years later, on the anniversary of their wedding day, Daniel took Grace back to the crossroads where they had first met. They brought their two young children, Samuel, age 3, and Emma, just learning to walk, and a picnic basket. "Why here, Dan?" Grace asked as he spread a blanket beneath the same cottonwood trees where his wagon had once waited. Daniel smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening, lines that Grace loved because they spoke of laughter and life shared together. "Because this is where our story began," he said simply. "The most important journey of my life started at this crossroads. I wanted our children to know the place." As their children played nearby, Daniel took Grace's hand, his thumb brushing over the gold band he had placed there 5 years earlier. "I have never regretted a single day of waiting," he told her. Grace leaned against his shoulder, watching their children chase butterflies through the prairie grass. "And I have never regretted the journey." In the distance, a stagecoach appeared on the horizon, following the same route that had brought Grace to Wyoming Territory years before, perhaps carrying another hopeful traveler toward their own beginning. Daniel and Grace watched it pass, then turned back to their children and the life they had built together, a life that had started with a promise kept at a Wyoming crossroads, where a patient cowboy had stood waiting for his future to arrive.